Good morning and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, your host. This is a show where we just sit around, we talk about games, we talk about things that we love, we talk about things that bring joy and beauty into our lives. And most of the time for me, that's going to be games. We're going to be talking about board games, role-playing games, doing game reviews like today. Today we're starting a series, a little three-part series, finishing up our Sword and Sorcery June. Hopefully next year that I can do the whole Sword and Sorcery June. We're going to be talking about a game that I have recently fallen head over heels in love with. But before we get into that, back in the early days of gaming, I would actually argue that the earliest days of gaming were not high fantasy. They weren't epic fantasy. The influence of Tolkien was actually minimal. It's not until we get to about second edition Dungeons and Dragons that we see the epic or high fantasy, the campaign, the story from zero to hero, the saving the world, the moving to what we have today in Dungeons and Dragons. That's really a second edition AD&D sort of evolution. The right around second edition, right before second edition, we had what some people call the Hickman Revolution, which was basically Dragonlance, where we went to this idea that, hey, we could tell a story from start to finish, and that could be the experience at the table. The table experience shifted to this, hey, we're going to tell the story of one group of characters, and we're going to move all the way through to the end of it. Good morning, everybody. Let's start saying, forgot about that. Hey, Brooke, good to see you. John Doom, good to see you. Padre, Evan, Mark, Tink, always good to see all of you. Yes, Padre just put up there that the Mongoose Traveler Humble Bundle is going live. It is super tempting. I have most of the PDFs. The PDFs are gorgeous. It's a great adaptation of Traveler. If you want to go check it out, go over to Humble Bundle. It's Traveler is a great science fiction, hard science fiction setting and system. So anyway, the rules gradually shifted away from or into this model of, hey, we're gonna tell the story of essentially one group on an epic quest. And excuse me, what do I mean by that? Well, we saw a shift away from sort of module adventures earlier into kind of more what we have today with the adventure path or the campaign books. Character creation and character evolution became less tied to what happened to you in the game and more tied to what's in your class. And because you were investing so much in the story as the GM and the characters as the players, characters became more resilient. Because nothing's worse than, if you have this whole story planned out and, somebody dies unexpectedly. So why am I saying all this? Well, because before that, in the early OD&D first edition BX days, the world was darker, it was grimmer, and it was less about the entirety of the thing and more about the episodic nature, the modules. That's why they're called modules, because you were able to drop them in. And instead of epic or heroic or epic or high fantasy, what we had was a very strong sword and sorcery feel. If you go back to our videos on where we dissected genres of fantasy, you can see what I mean about sword and sorcery. But the influences are there. If you go back and look at the books that influenced the early Dungeons and Dragons designers, Tolkien's on the list, yes, but his voice is sort of drowned out by Paul Anderson, Clark Ashton Smith, Jack Vance, Fawford and the Grey Mouser, Robert E. Howard's Conan. Grom, good to see you. Thanks. Glad to be back in action. And so, as you may have picked up on this channel, I'm a massive fan of sword and sorcery. I think there are some exemplars of the field. I'm reading through Howard's complete Conan tales with my son Zane right now, and he is loving them. And again, Sword and Sorcery has this feel of a little bit darker world, a little bit more morally ambiguous heroes, although still heroic. The thing about Conan is he never thinks twice about saving the people that he comes in contact with, as long as they haven't betrayed him or, are inherently evil like a sorcerer. So, in modern day gaming, we have fewer and fewer choices, both in fantasy and in gaming for sword and sorcery gaming. The upcoming Thieves World one is going to be one that I hope is a great introduction to sword and sorcery for a lot of people. If you're looking for books, A Land Fit for Heroes by Richard K. Morgan, or Anna Smith Sparks has just released A Woman of the Sword, and has a great new book coming out that I've heard a lot of good buzz about, that I just actually picked up this morning, pre-ordered it, called... That's the problem. Sometimes my brain is not as responsive. A Sword of Bronze and Ashes. I'll let you guys know how it is. Anna Smith Sparks is one of my favorite grimdark authors, and I'm really looking forward to see this new example, this new piece from her. So that brings us to what we're talking about today. Hyperborea. So Hyperborea, today is just an overview. We're going to talk a little bit about it. Look at that cover. It's gorgeous. And for some of our older gamers outside, you should recognize this orange. This orange fits very nicely on the shelf next to the old first edition books. And Hyperborea, I would argue, is a first edition D&D based clone. What's interesting to me is if you look at the OSR, most of the OSR in the D20 space are riffing off of BX and not first edition, which is interesting to me. I mean, as I said, I got into the game in second edition, but first edition has always been sort of the... First and second are kind of very... Second is really more of a clarification and a consolidation of the first edition rules. I was actually kind of shocked when I looked through and saw there are fewer first edition clones than there are BX clones. Anyway, Hyperborea delivers on the promise of swords, sorcery, and weird science fantasy. It takes its inspiration from even more old school sword and sorcery, and then adds in the layer of H.P. Lovecraft and really Clark Ashton Smith. This idea that it's not just fantasy. There is science out there from the older races that no one really understands. Sort of like, the Migo, or the Yuggoth, or the... Yeah, we're going to stop there. So, I mean, you can just take a look at this picture. We have a giant spider, a wizard, a barbarian, and what may be a paladin or a fighter. Kind of a quintessential fantasy cover, standing on top of what seems to be a ruined satellite or starship of some sort, with clearly Cthulhian alien entities inside of it. Now, Mark, before you go, JM, not another game that we're going to play. Don't worry, when we get back to it and we try this game, it's essentially first edition Dungeons & Dragons. You'll know it and love it. I realize that Rook said that I realize there's an example of Hyperborea's theme is, yeah. So that's a good point, Rook. This is not unique to the Dungeons and Dragons fantasy. I think the best example from an old school module is the Expedition to Barrier Peaks. Where you go to Barrier Peaks and discover that there's an entire starship crashed in the mountain. So this was there in the earlier editions of the game. And it gets left behind in the transition from first edition to second edition. I could probably talk for hours about what influenced that and how that... I mean, you can see the march through second, third, fourth to fifth, and now to fifth forever, or one D&D or whatever it ends up being coming, the 2024 rule books that are coming out next year. I'm glad that you are down with this, Mark, because there's something great about a game where your barbarian can find radiation grenades in a cache in the dungeon and then you know, horribly irradiate their enemies in a uh, in a small area of effect. John Doom says it sounds a bit like Rifts, but then again, yeah, Rifts gets a lot weirder than that, John. And I think you're right. It's sort of like let's put everything in the pot. Science fantasy has this feel of what is alien is has access to this higher tech. What is old has access to this higher tech. Humanity is just, kind of scrounging and scrumming through the remnants of these things. Now, what I really want to talk about in this first one is the overview of Hyperborea. Talked a little bit about the rules and the influences. Hyperborea, I was actually turned off to it for a very long time until I started reading more science fantasy because Hyperborea's setting is bizarre. So, first of all, Hyperborea takes place on a hexagonal flat Earth orbiting Saturn in the far future. So, you have this landmass surrounded by ocean that flows off the side, and you have Saturn in the night sky. You have a distant, distant red sun. Uh, and all of it's humanocentric. You can only play humans in this game. So whatever race or tribe you come from, except if you're Atlantean, has no effect on your attributes, your skills, your gameplay. Atlanteans just get to breathe underwater, and all of the human tribes from or who are in Hyperborea are actually from Earth. The idea being that at one point, Hyperborea somehow was either on Earth or coterminous with Earth. And when people journeyed into the north, because Hyperborea is a term that just means, above the borealis, above the north. Greco-Romans had it. The people of the English Isles had references to these. Lots of people, the Inuit cultures, have references to this idea of things living up beyond the north. And the idea is some of these people from Earth ended up there. So you have Lemurians and Atlanteans. You have Greeks and Romans. The Roman people are all descended from the lost legion that went missing in Britannia. You have Inuit people. You have just a lot of human cultures that have arrived here on Hyperborea, and they're kind of pulling themselves out, right? Sword and sorcery kind of requires a setting that has, we'll call it the points of light setting. You have civilization, which is usually decadent and corrupt, but there's a lot of unknown area beyond. And this green plague, this green death came and swept through Hyperborea several centuries ago, and humanity's kind of rebuilding itself from the ashes. Yes, Mark, it's like I would get to play I would get to play a lost legion, descendant of a lost legion there, and I think that would be just amazing. So, what you have in this setting is again humanocentric, Earth influenced from long ago, and you have all of the trappings of fantasy. You have gods, you have priests, you have mages, you have warriors, you have rogues and thieves. You go out into dungeons, you go out into search into the unknown and bring back things to civilization. On the flip side, you also have everything that you would expect out of a Cthulhian and Lovecraftian game. Cthulhu is one of the gods that people serve. There are hybrid species that exist on the shores of Hyperborea. The Migo mine and steal people for their own experiments. Demons rise up out of from beneath Hyperborea or summoned from the strange moons. It's a very unique setting. And I think it took me time to go back and, as I was rereading through my Sword and Sorcery sources, to really appreciate. Like, I loved the humanocentric, I loved the rule set, I loved the art. I just couldn't get behind this idea of this landmass floating off by Saturn. But Jeffrey Talanian did an amazing job with the setting. He is the kind of world designer that I enjoy. So, for the example, Hyperborea has a very strange calendar because it's so far out. What you have is actually a 13-year cycle. Let me pull this up. You can play Carolingian Franks, Mark. Um, so you end up having an entire year of darkness and an entire year of daylight. There's a little chart that tells you, based off what year you're at in the cycle and what month you're in, how many hours of daylight you have. Yeah, that's the kind of detail that I actually really love in a game. And it's spread out over 2 books now. So this is the uh, player's manual, and when we dig into the player's manual and show off the classes and what you can play next week, or yeah, next week on Tuesday, we'll show off some of the interior art. When we get to the referee's manual, I'll show the art off from there as well. But it's got everything you need. Between these 2 books, it has everything you need. The player's guide has all of the rules for being a player, your classes, how combat works, gear, all of the race and cultural overviews. The referee's manual is the bestiary, how to run the game, has some of the best advice on actually what it means to be a game master out there today. It gives you a little bit more detail on the settings. The monsters are fantastic. They are not your typical D&D monsters. You have crabmen, and yeah, we'll get into that later. But crabmen with cybernetic laser arms, if that sounds cool to you, this is the game that you're going to want to check out. It's got rules for weather and travel and mass combat, so it's a complete game. So the plan is we're going to look at player options on Tuesday of next week, what the GM has available to them on Thursday of next week, and the final part of our 4-part look of Hyperborea are the modules. And I'm going to be honest, they are really where this game shines. The modules for Hyperborea are some of the best on the market today. You just need a module to drop in somewhere. Go look at hyperborea.tv and check it out. Each of their modules is in the area of about 60 pages or thereabouts. And with each one, not only are you getting the adventure, you're getting a ton of resources around the adventure. So for one of them, you're trying to get to the dungeon and solve it. Clear it out, save the world or save the area, that sort of thing. Not a whole lot of save the world going on in Sword and Sorcery. There's a lot of save the town here. But of course, they give you 2 to 5 pages of the town and the people who have their own agendas and quests that you can flesh out. They give you a hex map of the region with 5 to 10 additional sites that all tie in together or have their own threads that a GM, you could take one of their modules and have enough inspiration to just spread out and run a lot more than just what's contained in there. I really adore this game. Sort of came out of nowhere. I was flipping through my Instagram feed, and I have a lot of role play, RPG, reviewers and stuff on there, and somebody was waxing very eloquently about this. So I went out and bought it. You can get it on DriveThruRPG. That's where the PDFs are, or you can buy the physical copies from Hyperborea.tv. He just ran a Kickstarter to produce gorgeous maps of the Hyperborea area. And again, when I say it's just this one landmass on kind of on this hexagon floating around in space, you would not run out. You would not want for space in this area. Hyperborea has enough going on in it to run a campaign for years on end. So that's where we're going to pause for today. Again, if you want to check it out, I'll put the links in the show notes, hyperborea.tv. That's the easiest way to go. If I have one thing to say, and I understand the reasoning, as a small publisher, I understand the reasoning around it. You can get the PDFs or you can get the physical books. As far as I could tell, there's no bundle between the two of them. But here's the thing. Jeffrey Talanian has put together a wonderful, great game. And I said this about Peg. Dungeon Professor just pointed it out, and I'm going to steal it from him this week. When you buy a game like this, yeah, it may be more expensive than something you could find on Amazon. Yeah, it may be nice to buy a book that has both the PDF and the physical copy together. But when you buy something from like Hyperborea, this is a labor of love. This is the third edition of this game. Jeffrey has continued to refine it. This is his labor of love. This is how he supports his family. When you buy Hyperborea, you are actually helping one person help those around them. When you buy Peg products, you are helping a very tight-knit group of people stay afloat, pay their bills, and help the people around them. I can say that they help the people around them. Yes, I do work for Peg, but they really helped out in these last couple of months. So, if you can find a small independent game that you like, know that that money is going directly to them to help them pay their bills, to help them keep the lights on, to help them produce the next thing that they love, to share it with you. So yeah, check out Hyperborea if it is all interesting. We're going to be talking about it for the next 3 behind the screens because, again, there's just so much. The 2 manuals cover, I think, about 600 pages of material. So yeah, we'll be looking at character options because who doesn't love sweet character options? What's cool? Now we'll get into that. I won't get. I'll give a little teaser. There are the 4 classes: fighter, thief, mage, and priest or cleric, and then there are 4 to 8 subclasses for each. And what I love what Jeffrey has done is it's really cool to play a cataphract. But there is a mechanical benefit for just playing a fighter. While you may like the subclasses, there's something you are actually rewarded for playing a base class as opposed to one of the subclasses. So we're going to show off all the cool art in the player's manual, not all of it, but some of it. We're going to talk about all of the options that you get to play. Professor and Grom, I didn't say good morning to you guys. Hello. People who like savory character options, that's who I know you do. I know you do, Rook. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your support, for your well wishes. I will get this video to post later today so that if you need more links, you can go out. You can get the PDFs on DriveThruRPG. Just search for Hyperborea. If you want physical copies, hyperborea.tv. Super easy to remember. And until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I am JM. This has been Behind the Screen, and I will talk to you all soon. Have a good one.